Welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar hosted by the Organization Development and Change Program at Penn State. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming our presenter, Dr. Dave Jamieson. My name is Layla Farzam, and I am the Alumni Ambassador for the Organization Development and Change Program. We also have Sagun with us today, who will be managing our chat and Q&A features. In terms of the interactive format for this webinar, please open the chat feature in the Zoom platform to interact and ask questions for the Q&A segment. If for some reason you get disconnected from our webinar, please use the same Zoom link to re-enter. Our online Master of Professional Studies in Organization Development and Change can help you prepare to implement quality and continuous improvement initiatives in an organization. Furthermore, there's a PhD program in Workforce Education and Development with a concentration in Human Resource Development and Organization Development. Our program has created a continuous monthly webinar series from experts around the world. Today, we welcome Dr. Jamieson.
Dr. Jamieson is the president of Jamieson Consulting Group, Inc., and semi-retired professor at the University of St. Thomas, OD&C department. He has over 50 years of practice experience consulting to organizations on leadership, change, strategy, design, and human resources issues. He also has 10 years of experience in academia and scholarly research. Dr. Jamieson became a scholar practitioner early in his career. Bridging the gap between research and practice in OD&C is important to him, and he believes that the field needs focused scholarship, practice, and development to move forward. Here's Dr. Jamieson.
Thank you, Sigon and Layla. I'd like to welcome everyone wherever you happen to be. It's morning in Minnesota in the US. So it's my pleasure basically to talk with you and share some about use of self-work, which has been with me most of my career, but very intensively in the last 10 years has been a very strong focus in my work. And it's starting to make sense now, so I don't mind sharing lots of stuff with people. And I hope that you'll find a few ways that you can begin to use it right away. And so as I change this, it's not moving at the moment. Let's see here. It seems that the slides aren't moving. Let me see. No.
Dr. Jamieson, feel free to unshare and share again. Maybe that will help the freeze.
That's probably what it is. Yeah, okay. It hasn't happened. Usually it doesn't happen, but it may be that. No, it's not a freeze. I'm not able to make the changes of the slides for some reason. Here's another way I can do it maybe. If I get it out of slide mode. So I share the screen and I use this one. See if that'll change. That still doesn't change.
How about I go ahead and share my screen and you can just tell me when to.
That's fine. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Yeah. I never had that happen. I don't know what's going on. But you share and we'll go to the first slide. The session flow slide. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Anyway, I'm going to speak to most of the slides, but I think we have more than our time today might cover. But there are more details in the slides, which you'll have access to. And also the global research part of it will have, the report is available to you. You can just download it and it has all the detail. So I want to pick out highlights from the research part. But some of the conceptual pieces I want to say a few things about. And basically I want to talk mostly about core and basic concepts, the global research findings, and then we will have some questions and discussion. Next one. Use of self needs to be personal and experiential. Usually when people are together, we have people do things that help them, one, use this content to focus mostly on themselves and to bring some of their own personal self and characteristics into their thinking. So what I wanted to ask you to do is please be thinking about some relevant aspects to yourself throughout what we talk about. Think about things like something you know gets in your way. I remember when I was about 25 and my mentor at the time was Bob Tannenbaum at UCLA. And there was a time in one of our one-on-one sessions where he said, you know, Dave, you have the potential to be great if you can ever get out of your own way. And ever since then, I've always watched how often someone else is not creating a barrier for me, but maybe I'm creating the barrier. So think about something you know that gets in your way, or think about something you always need to manage, or when you experience vulnerability, what brings that out in you? Something that you do exceptionally well, keep that front and center. Something you know about yourself that often surprises you. That is, something happens, you react in certain ways, and you're sometimes surprised by it. Those are ways to help us stay personal as we're listening to content about this. Next one. Wherever you go, there you are. That's a title of a book, actually, from mindfulness practitioners. But I think it's very important. And the reason I like it so much is we forget that all of who we are comes with us. When you show up, who you are comes with you. And this is where I think our fast-paced world sometimes gets in the way, because we may not enter a situation realizing that we're bringing all of our best selves, and we're bringing a little bit of baggage along with that because we're human. And the question is, if we're not aware of that, then it can get in the way of the work we're doing. So next one. When things go well or when they don't, what we often don't do is think about that missing piece, which is ourself. In fact, in our society, at least, it appears to me that we are much more rapid at looking outside of ourselves than we are looking inside of ourselves. So when something doesn't work, we look for someone to blame, or we look for some contextual thing that we can blame. And those things are important. Others and context do affect what happens, but they are not the only piece. And when we ignore ourselves, then we're not looking at the whole possibility of what's possible to make whatever we're trying to do work better. Next one. I went back to study Lewin's field theory a little more. Of course, you hear about it in your education, but when I started, after I've had some years of practice, I think the field theory really helps us to understand some of what we have to deal with in use of self, because our behavior happens at the intersection of us interacting with others in a context. And I think when we understand that better, then we start to begin to look at all those three pieces sometimes when we're trying to understand how can we be successful with our intention in whatever situation we're in. Because each situation has different context, and each situation has different people and different players very often. And what's also interesting is every time we enter something new, we may be a little bit different as well. So next one. This gives us, what I love about this is it gives us many opportunities. And our opportunities are, we can behave the same or differently. We always have that choice. If we're not aware of it, then that's what we need to work on. But we always can behave the same as we always do, or we can behave differently. we can see and understand what's going on. We have many opportunities to interpret what's in front of us and around us each time. We can consider choices. What are the options I have when I make behavioral choices? To pause enough to be mindful. If we are rapid, if our head is moving too fast and if our body is moving too fast, we will overlook many choices, or we will not be very present in that particular situation. And we choose to be fully present or not. We can live distracted or we can live in the present. And that takes practice, of course. All these things take practice. But every opportunity we're in gives us another chance to work at it. We can have clear intention in what we want to do. That is, we have a role and we have ourselves who come together to work in service of other people through a whole variety of roles we might be in. The question is, what's our intention? How do we want to operate? We have to manage ourselves. We have opportunities to manage ourselves. And some of that is self-discipline and some of that is self-control, but a lot of that is also freedom of choice in terms of what's the best thing to do here. And then finally, we have the opportunity to learn from each experience. And I'll say more about that on another slide, because I think what's fascinating about use of self is we can all get better. And it doesn't end after you do a little training or you get a degree. It never ends. It's a continuous process that we have to do in order to stay abreast of how we're showing up, what impact we're having, and is that in line with our intention or not. So that's the thing. Next slide. Every situation, system, or encounter we enter is a new opportunity to be your best self. No matter how bad last week's meeting was, no matter how you didn't feel right about what you said to somebody, all of those are past history. The question is, every new situation, every new encounter, and every new conversation in some ways allows you the opportunity that I just went over, all those kinds of opportunities for you to be your best self. Next. A question that we might get started with is, think of one aspect or behavior that you wish you could change or improve about yourself. We all have one or two usually, and just type something in the chat box so we can all look for a minute and see what stands out or what themes pop up when people just randomly answer this question. Now, I don't know if I can see them. Let me see. Here we go. Yep. Wow. Excellent, excellent. And by the way, these things are relatively common around the world. Confidence questions, patience questions, being able to be present in today's crazy world, listening to others. These kinds of things come up often, and it's really good to start your own thinking about use of self through this question. It's a good place to start. What do I wish I was able to do differently? Or how is one of my behaviors getting in my way at work or at home, wherever it happens to be? So these are great, and they will be in the chat, which is super. Thank you very much. Let's go to the next slide. What is involved in use of self? So here's how we've narrowed it down now. One is our self-awareness. We cannot stop learning about who we are. And we don't start that out with a high level of judgment. We start that out with understanding who we are. We are complex systems that have been developed along thousands of pathways and influences. So we learn about ourselves, and then later we begin to think about, in our work and in our relationships, in what ways does who we are help or hinder what I wished I could do. So that's where we start to use a tiny bit of judgment just to help us get on a developmental path. The goal and use of self is to be doing self-development. The second thing is our continuous action learning cycles, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But as I said, every situation is a new opportunity to be your best self. It's also, each one is a new opportunity to learn something new. The third piece is our capabilities. We build our capabilities on the knowledge side, and we build our capabilities on the skill side. And over time, we develop those things in ourselves. And the reason it's so powerful in use of self is what we are able to do or what we are able to understand helps us in each of those new situations when we're trying to interpret what's actually going on. Our continuous self-development is a very important element in this work. And the last one is our purposeful self-management. And that is, we are paying attention to the ways in which our cognitive and emotional systems work to either help us behave in ways that we intend or guard against ways that we don't intend that happen, that pop out of us or that happen in us. We all have things that we don't fully control. It's just in human nature. But the more we know about it, then the more we have opportunities. Next one. So when we're understanding ourselves, here's one model, and there's two slides here on this. One is we always have presenting selves. That is, they're intentional. We develop who we want to show up as. And in some ways, I'm most interested in the authentic self, as who are you really? Because there's a lot of presenting selves in which we decide what image we want and what we want people to think about who we are, whether or not it's real. And authentic would keep us to be more real when we're doing this. Sometimes we have habitual selves. That is, they show up on a regular basis. We've learned it probably as a child. We've learned it as a protection and defense. And so we have things, the way our self gets presented. Over on the other side, we have hidden, denied, and unknown selves. We call that the shadow side. And the shadow side is real. Some of it we are a little bit aware of, and some of it we do not know at all. And some of the work we do over time is we learn more about our unknown selves. We learn more about things that we may have hidden or denied because of ways we acted at one time, and now we think it's no longer part of us. The center gives us a sense of, when we're trying to figure out how do we understand ourselves, these are some of the characteristics that we might want to look at. We certainly have personality factors, and you know there's 1,000 personality instruments, and most everybody gets to take one or two in their life. Same thing with traits, characteristics, and styles. We get lots of tools that help us do that. But what they tell us about is they tell us about some things that are wired pretty hardwired, and other things that are highly changeable. And our attitudes and values are the same thing. Values tend to stay pretty strong with us, but lifetime crisis will change our values all the time. I know many people, mid-career and older is when they've actually changed some of their values. Other values get formed as one grows up, and those values may or may not work well for you in the environment that you're in today. Identities are very important. We have gender, racial, cultural, and professional identities. And then we have knowledge and skills, the reason we go to school, the reason you study things at Penn State and other places. So all of these things together make up what we call understanding ourselves. Next one. And just a different version of the same thing is to say that self-understanding is in the center. And I use that phrase more often than self-awareness because self-awareness has been picked up pretty heavily in the pop literature these days, and sometimes gets misused like that's an end result as opposed to that's the first step to behaving differently. So self-understanding is just another way of saying, what do I know about myself, and can I keep learning more as I experience different situations? Next. The Johari window, many of you probably have studied this. It's part of a lot of OD education, and it's a fascinating tool to help us understand ourselves and our relationships. And so the Johari window is there's things about ourselves that we know, and there's things about ourselves we don't know. But guess what? All those people who are close to us and around us and work with us, they know a whole lot of those things. So feedback is the breakfast of champions. Feedback is critical. It's the only way we can see parts of ourselves that we're not actually aware of. And then what's known to others and what's not known to others is a function of our self-disclosure. And in what ways we hold back or share with other people, that allows other people to understand us better. When we are low in self-disclosure, low in feedback, we are living with a partial picture of who we are. And we have not really invited other people in to help us learn and see that. So the Johari window is fascinating. And I had the honor of actually studying with Harry Ingham. This was done by Joe Luft and Harry Ingham. And Harry Ingham was at UCLA when I was there. And we were able, there was 7 of us that wanted to create a special seminar with him. And so we spent whatever it was, 15 weeks one spring, meeting with him each week and just learning from his style. And I have to tell you, it was fantastic. I've never seen anybody say very little and yet facilitate the group all the time. And so that, and of course, he was from the T group era and he was very good at that. But what else we learned about him is he was really, really, really strong on this, on how important feedback was and why when people give feedback poorly, it alienates us from getting more feedback, and also the value of getting that feedback from more than one person so that we begin to triangulate things that we're learning about ourselves. And at some point, everybody gets an aha. Or maybe next week they get a different aha. They get an aha that says, yes, that does make sense to me. I now can see that that is what I do, or that's how I show up in those meetings, or whatever it happens to be. So next, but this is a helpful tool. So who we are is the personality factors, values, capabilities, identities. Then there's pattern behaviors that help and hinder us. You know, from neuroscience, our brain just loves repetitive pathways, neural pathways. So very often, if we don't pause enough to make a choice, we will always do pattern behaviors. We will keep doing what we've done habitually. And sometimes we do it because we think, again, because we don't get good feedback, we think the way we're doing it is always right. And I think context trips us up a lot on that. So we take what we did last week in situation A, and we use the same behavior in situation B this week. That's where we're not being present. We're not paying attention to the interaction effects of context. And so pattern behaviors are a way of life. We all build patterns. We all love routines. Our brain just loves to operate on autopilot. And if we don't override that in some ways, then we will, in fact, just act habitually in most situations. And then the personas and shadows are important. The known ones are the personas, and the shadows are usually lesser known. And what's interesting is people who are close to us usually can tell aspects of our shadow better than we can. And that is, a shadow means that there are certain triggers or certain things people will say or certain situations we'll walk into, and rather than the normal behavior that everybody thinks of when they meet with Dave, all of a sudden Dave acts a little differently. And the people closer to us can point that out quicker than we will see it, because usually it's an emotional trigger that taps something in our shadow. Okay, so, and they're not good or bad necessarily. Sometimes they're wonderful. Because what's fascinating is we don't always hide things that we're ashamed of or embarrassed by. We also hide sometimes our belief in ourselves and how good we are. And so others sometimes have to help tap that side of the shadow. Next. Okay, so now the continuous action learning cycle. This is what I mean by every situation and every encounter and every time you go to work to do something. So here we go. We start with a situation. When we have a situation and we're in some role, we're either a family member role, or let's take work, for example. We're an HR person, we're an OD person, we're the leader. We're in a role and we're in a situation. The next most important thing is to decide what our intention is. That is, our intention for our role means, how do I want to show up? How do I want to behave? What kind of impact do I want to have? And when we don't think of that, just remember, our habitual train will always bring something out. And then we're in this situation. Now we have to make sense of it. We have to try to figure out what's actually going on here. What are the possibilities? What's needed? How am I interpreting the situation? And again, education, theories, models, those things help us when they're in our head. If we're not thinking about them, then maybe they're not helping us in that situation. Then we have to think about choices, and choices are, what can I do here? I used to love Marv Weisberg wrote one book, something about just stand there, don't do anything. And that was his way of saying we often intervene too much, we say too much, we do too much, and sometimes we need to step back. But I just like the range of choices being important. What are some actions that would make sense here? If I'm the leader, or if I'm not the leader, what can I do in my role in this situation? So the idea, and these are in what I call pauses, and they're not long, or they're just a practice one learns to say, let me think for a second, because I can feel my urge is to say something that's going to be a little harsh. What can I do to override that? And what can I do to pause just a speck, so I can think about what other choices might be? And then we take action. We all do something. We sit there or we do something. And once we take action, impacts happen to you and to other people. And then we have to take time afterwards to reflect a little bit, or else the learning goes down the drain. The experience happens, but the learning occurs with the reflective piece of the cycle. Now you'll see that the C part is in there. C is one of the capabilities I'll talk about in a minute. The purpose is your intention. What's the purpose in my role? The sense making is the know part of capabilities. Choices are looking at different things that we can do, and then whatever we do is the do capability. And again, our actions are also limited by our confidence and by our courage and by what we know how to do. So why do we keep learning? Why do we keep getting better? Is because we want an action portfolio. We do not want a single action that we do every time. So next one. So the continuous action learning cycles is every time we go anywhere, what do we see? And the word notice is really important. One of the things we get people to practice a lot is, what do they notice? Now remember the field theory again, self, other, context. How we take in using our 6 senses is really important. So we improve our C capability by the way we notice and take things in. Our purpose or intention is, given the role and the others, what do we think we should be doing? And how do we quickly make sense? That's our know capability. What do we think we know? And then we determine choices. What can I do? What am I willing to do? And what am I comfortable with? And that's why we are very limited sometimes in our choices. Because I can tell you, I was in situations in the beginning of my career where people were arguing and in conflict, and I had such a resistance to conflict, because a lot of it happened in my household. And I know that what I used to do was get really good at trying to figure out ways to smooth that out rather than let it happen. So that was a behavior I was doing to self-defend myself, not to help that client system. So what's important now is to recognize when I'm not comfortable with something, that may be an area of development for me. Then we select and take action. We do something. And we reflect on the action and the outcomes and the impacts, and that's where we get the learning later. So next one. Our capabilities are a combination of our knowledge, skills, and processes we use. They're developed over time, and they help us perform. In use of self, there are 3 that are critical. Next one. So when I first started this work, I worked with David Scheckman and Matt Aron, 2 of the students I had at Pepperdine years ago. And we wrote this article where we talked a lot about the use of self capabilities. And so it's see, know, and do at the bottom. And then over our lifetime, we move from functionality to efficacy to mastery, just like everything else in the mastery literature. It's all moving. How do we build ourselves so we can do these things better? So seeing, knowing, and doing. And what was very clear to me is when I was in my doctorate, we did tons of group work and tons of T groups and everything else. But I had people in my cohort, and we would be observing groups. And I would do my best job to see what I could see going on. And there was this one guy, one of my good friends. He was so good at taking in what was going on in that system, whatever that group happened to be. And I kept wondering, why did I not see that? So I used to work with him a little bit and ask a lot of questions. And what it told me was, it told me that there are things about who I am that were blocking some of that data. And he didn't have those. So in some ways, when we all got to review at the end of the day, and I said, here's what I thought was going on. And then he says, here's what I thought was going on. It was bigger. It was larger. It had more data in it. So anyway, that's how these things became important to me. Next. Continuous self-development. Action learning cycles provide opportunities for improvement. Every one of them is a new chance to learn. We must keep adding knowledge, skills, conscious presence, and capabilities. It's lifelong. The world and we continue to change. And we don't fix this by finishing a course. We don't fix this with a weekend workshop. We get the whole of ourselves over time. And that's a good thing, actually, because without the experiences cycling in, we would never really understand how we handle different situations. And that's where we want to build some mastery. Next. We're continuously monitoring our own and others' states. We're trying to be alert in the present to what's happening. Our understanding, agility, and repertoire will give us ways to pivot and shift. If we don't have options, if we don't have behavioral choices, we're stuck. We're very habitual. Keeping choices conscious helps to provide options for us. And remember that we only control ourselves and influence others. All this trying and all these years of trying to control everybody else just rubs me the wrong way, because I'm sure there's times that I've tried to control other people too. And 9.5 times out of 10, that just never works. So, but we can control ourselves and we can make better choices. Next. So use of self plays out on the front and back stages. On the front, it's how we show up and what we do and our experiences of action learning cycles and the way our self-management is handled, and others notice that too. And then how we and others are impacted, how we felt about that, what we saw happen. Those are important on the front stage. On the back stage, we have our reflective practices. How good are we at building learning from experience? Building our capabilities, getting better at see, know, and do, learning new methods and techniques that give us better choices. Our self-development and self-care is in the background. We have to pay attention to it being continuous, and the self-care part is particularly valuable in our field because doing change work is one of the most taxing cognitive and emotional tasks we can do. And we are not a good field for self-care. People need to pay attention to that. Developing self and other awareness. What am I feeling in myself? What am I seeing and interpreting in other people? And then dealing with fears, building our confidence and our courage. The role of courage is critical whenever one needs to do something that's difficult or out of the ordinary. Courage is the one thing we have to rely on. And not everybody grows up with courage. So we sometimes have to work on that. Next. So I've said for years, the one with the largest view wins. And where I actually got it from was with leaders I had as consultants. I could tell day and night difference between leaders who had a large view and leaders who were very functional in their thinking. And so what happens with a large view is you see the whole system and you learn about interaction effects. When you're focused deeply on marketing, but you're a CEO of an organization with at least 5 functions and people all around the world, you're missing a lot when you're too narrowly focused. So then I learned that it was also in the 40 some years that I did full-time practice in consulting, was that the same thing was true. Whenever I got into a narrow band of looking at things, or I got all wrapped up in a little piece of a project, I was no longer seeing the whole big picture. And if I couldn't see the big picture, I was very little help to a leader who might also have been struggling to see the big picture. And now in use of self, it comes back all again. And in our use of self, it's how much we see and take in, the different ways that we can understand and internalize it, and what we can do makes a lot of difference. So the one with the largest view wins. And that actually came from a bumper sticker back in the 90s. And I mean, the thought for how to say this came from that, because I used to be driving on a freeway every day, and I was seeing a lot of these bumper stickers, and it says, the one with the most toys wins. And had something to do with people playing games and other stuff. But anyway, I said, no, it's not the toys that make a difference. It's the largest view. Next. Okay, I want to cover some highlights from our research. You can get all the detail in the report that's downloadable, and there's a lot more detail on some of the slides, which I will just touch on. I did this work with Cheung-Judge. She is brilliant, scholar practitioner, and I was honored to be partnering with her. We developed this over a period of a year. She did extensive background research in all of the psychological side and sociological side of where self gets discussed. And then from that, we created the next one. We created the first ever large-scale research on this use of self concept. We could not find, there's no research directly on it. We ended up with 704 participants from 45 countries and a good demographic mix. We assessed things about how people defined and described it, how well, often, or much they used various behaviors and practices. We developed the 130 some items from all of that background research. And then what barriers, internal and external, they dealt with, and how they saw their impacts, and how they developed their self or practice self-care. We asked questions about all of that in this survey. Next. So it was both quantitative with 119 scaled items and 7 open-ended questions. And we learned our lesson on that because it took ages to do the qualitative analysis on the open-ended questions. So we had some original help from St. Thomas when I was there. We distributed out through professional and educational organizations around the globe. We had about 35 co-sponsors with us to get the word out and to send the surveys out. The data was massive, and an organization in DC called The Clearing helped us with some of the organizing and analyzing. They volunteered to provide some of the technical help on doing that analysis. Next. So the quant data was factor analyzed. That is, we were looking to understand underlying patterns and groupings of those items into factors. And they produced factors that we could then score. Then we could take the whole sample and score against those factors. We also did scoring on all the sub-demographic groups and the country groups as well. So those are all in the report. The qualitative data was also being analyzed. We had multiple researchers do the qualitative analysis, and we ended up, they all were working with 8,600 or so responses that people made. Next. So I want to highlight the 5 factors, and I want to highlight the 4 categories that themes were organized into, and then the detail of all the theming on the qualitative side. I'll skip through some of that so we have a little time. But the 5 factors are important, I think. One is using cognitive and emotional skills. So different items fed into that factor and correlated highly across that large sample, so that we got using cognitive, the different ways in which we use cognitive and emotional skills was a critical factor. Attention to relationship-centric values and behaviors. It reinforced something about OD that we've known for a long time, that it's a very relationship-centric field of work. And this came out because different items that were spread out in this long survey would come together and get scored very similarly in this factor. So all the factors had very high loads for items, and we didn't use any item that loaded on 2 or 3 factors. So we got a pretty clean job on this one. The third one was self-management in emerging situations, meaning I was able to respond or not respond, or I acted well when things changed in front of me or whatever. And then 4th was the continuous development of self and other awareness. That is, all the things that had to do with continuous learning, continuing development, and the reason we needed to do that. All of the sample, by the way, had at least 5 years of OD experience. We had people with 40 years, we had people with 5 years, and all in between. And so we also broke the sample down that way as well. But what was important is this is the way all of the data came together to give us 4 factors. And then the 5th one is the impact of the best use of self. That is what people said they saw in themselves and others when they were operating at their best. So these 5 factors are now a new way to describe what is use of self about. What do we include in use of self? Next. I'll give you the scores so you can see the highest ones. Factor 2 had the highest global score, and factor 4 had the next highest, and then number 1 using cognitive emotional skills with courage to serve dynamic systems. Okay, so Mian was great about naming these things. She had all kinds of ways, words she wanted to use. But so we had, so these are the whole sample. This is 704 or so are in here. I think what's most interesting about it is what the top 1 or 2 are. The relationship-centric thing and the continuous self-development is really kind of interesting as a way that OD people are either trained or the way they think about some of what it is they're really doing. Next. So the open-ended questions produce numerous themes, but the themes we then organized more into these categories. So internal and external barriers to use of self. What keeps me from being my best self? Thousands of responses to that question. What outside of me keeps me from being my best self? Thousands of answers. And sometimes people answered similar things in each one, so we've tried to pull them back together to make sense of what is internal and what is external. But what's really important about this is people were very articulate about barriers, what gets in my way. And the top priorities in development, and then the type of development activities that seem to support their best use of self. Again, lots and lots of responses to that are grouped and into the report. Self-care habits to maintain energy, focus, and sharpness. What do people do? And again, there are, I think it was 20 or 30 categories of types of things people do for self-care. And then the impacts of the best use of self, what it creates for self and what it creates for others. And I'll highlight a few of those. I think this is the next area that needs a lot of work, because if we can't say that being your best self makes a difference, then why is anybody going to want to do it? I think we probably all know it intuitively, and we know it in our own experience. We know when we leave an event or a facilitation or whatever we've done, we say, oh my God, I nailed it today. Well, we don't say that every day. And so the point is, and when that happens, what else happens? What happens to the participants? What happens to others? And I think we got a lot of good starting data from our study, but I think there's research that's needed to go further on that. Move next one. All right, this is where I need to save some time, I think, and I'll skip over some of these, but look at the barriers from yourself. What's the first one? Lack of self-confidence, self-doubt, and fear. At least that's the highest. Personality and style, you have to go deeper to figure out what people are saying. And I love the myself in the way. That's exactly what I got when I was 25. So we'll go to the next one now. And external barriers. There was some of them, again, that we would actually take back to the internal side, that the self was the main barrier. But the others part is that sometimes clients, colleagues, and partners, they are blaming or saying are a barrier. Things about environments, misalignment of focus and expectations, and you can see much more here. But the idea is some people see it as inside self and some people see it as outside self. What I take away from our study is I think we got a lot of clarity and articulation of what it is. We can even probably group it differently again now and probably consolidate it. So I hope to do that. Next one. What are the top priorities you have in developing the effectiveness of your use of self? Deepening my self-awareness, getting to know who I am better, my understanding of self and my understanding of others, better self-management, whatever that might involve. Remember when we put stuff in the chat, some of those things would require someone to pay attention to that and manage that. Self-care. We don't do very good self-care, I don't think, in this field. And then needing to work on some of my own unresolved issues. Usually what happens with unresolved issues is, they nag us once in a while. Occasionally they'll come out in the middle of our work. And that's why it's important to deal with those. Next. These are just more of the same thing. Getting more feedback, receiving coaching, continuous learning to develop myself. I think these things can probably be pulled together a little better, but all these details are in the report. Next. What are some of the more regular activities you do to improve your use of self? Reflective activities pulled up. And I think reflective that piece of the action learning cycle is so critical, and a lot of people recognize that they don't do it very often. Debriefing and feedback, attending workshops, that's building knowledge and skills. Continuous learning's the same thing. Some people mention spiritual practice, mindfulness, meditation. Those things are helpful to them in terms of improving their use of self. Next. The more regular activities, practicing intentionally, that is, you know how they talk about you have to do practice for a certain amount of time to become masterful at anything? This is a good connection for all that. We need to practice the things that we need to work on. And we don't need to practice all the things we already do really well, but we need to practice the things that we don't. And practice does make better. Therapy, some people said practice. There we go. Next one. So these are some of the qualitative things. The self-care habits, I put priorities to maintain my physical well-being, recreation, doing fun things. I used to laugh at that because I said I was working 60 hours a week. What time was left for the recreation? But I know better now. keep learning and growing. Building positivity is an interesting one because we live in a time where sometimes it's hard for people to feel that positive, and we have to feel good, even if nothing else. We have to feel good about ourselves, and we have to feel good about the work we're doing. Next. What impacts do you personally feel your best use of self creates? This is the beginning of where I think more research is needed. Providing safety and spaciousness for others to do their work. People become bigger and have more confidence. If you create the right space, the client can do better work and become more confident. People often become more self-aware and more open if you are creating it through your best self. Understanding of self and others were improved with better relationships and conversation, and people are able to see better and generate new perspectives and increase hope. Next. Take action to shift, work to impact the system differently. Some people just talked about their definition of use of self and how does use of self impact the practitioners. Anyway, next. So you'll see that there's a lot of detail there. A few key things I'd want to say. Our attitudes towards people and our willingness to put relationships as our top work is more important than any tools and clever methodologies. That's where we say use of self is the central instrument in the work we do. Without the habit of lifelong learning, our practice will not sustain. Without that willingness and motivation to become more grounded and more confident and less reactive, then we're not very available to those we help. We are setting both ourselves and our clients up for ineffective outcomes and incomplete experiences. Experiences in education do make some difference. And when we scored those factors based on education level and experience level, it showed up higher. So we think education and experience does make some difference. And it's not the tools and methodologies that will make us masterful. It's the way we use ourselves in the moment to achieve impact and change. And if internal and external variables are in some form reflective of how practitioners may feel about their agency and competence, in other words, the more people are dealing with barriers, the less they feel agency and they start to doubt and feel low in confidence. We need to educate, that we need, how we educate needs some revision in this field. We need to help people be aware of that up front. Because when they leave the safety of their university or their workshop or wherever they go, they're often alone when they're experiencing this stuff. And we need to help people realize how to deal with barriers that come up and how to not lose their confidence in the middle of it. Next. So this is where you can download the reports in two different layouts. And this report was just launched April of this year. The research was done in 18 and 19, so we took a long time to get it done. Next. Take the next one. I want to say just a couple quick things and then try to have a little time on some questions. The definition that we made, I've kept this definition for the last 10 years. The use of self is the conscious use of one's whole being in the intentional execution of one's role for effectiveness in whatever the present situation is. It should always be thought of in some context and some roles. And so our intention becomes critical in the reality of what role am I in and what context am I in. The purpose is to be able to execute effectively in the presenting situation without a lot of our personal interference, which is usually biases, blind spots, or avoidance that we try to do. Like I told you about my story of when people were having conflict in the meetings, and with enough consciousness and presence to have clear intentionality. Consciousness and presence have become, in the last 10 years, I've seen that as more critical because I live in a world where 90% of the people feel distracted most of the time. And what I think that means is we don't bring all of our capabilities to whatever we're currently involved in. So it should always be in service of something else. Next one. It's the core element in how effective we are in executing the role. It is built on both our awareness and the clarity of our intentions, combined with consciousness in the situation, just having choices. If you have no choice, you are very stuck in the moment. And then managing ourselves purposely to act. Next. We can skip that one. It'll be in the slides. The self is the core instrument. We also, all you see, know, and understand, and are skilled to do comes through you as the instrument of delivery. So you may know a method really well, and you studied it, but how you deliver it is what really counts. Because for all those people impacted by it, it's your delivery that counts, not your knowledge. So we have to think about the ways in which we are an instrument. What you take in and is all part of who you are. And it's what you bring. I used to call, what do you bring to the party? You know, what is it you're bringing? What are you adding? And when you show up, there are impacts, perceptions, and feelings involving others that create narratives around you also. That is people's perceptions of you, people's interpretation of you, and ultimately your reputation. So you create your own internal narrative. So I used to walk away from sessions that I thought didn't go well and would blame myself, of course, and then I would tell myself, I'd have a story going on about what I did wrong. Sometimes I would find out that I was off in that, and in fact, the clients in the room felt it was wonderful. And so it's really important to keep balancing my narratives against the way other people are creating narratives. Yes, next. Just a couple of things. Without valid feedback, we are flying blindly on how effective and impactful we are. And I'll tell you, valid feedback doesn't come from just our best friends who always tell us we're wonderful. It's good to hear that, helps the day, doesn't give us valid feedback. So we need a combination of feedback, and we need to trust it. Yeah, so next one. What's not use of self is just growing self-awareness, but not taking action to change behavior. That's the secret. The secret of use of self is it's not a self-awareness pathway only. Just emotional intelligence. They are very helpful. Emotional intelligence is really good on relations and emotional management and very helpful. Just mindfulness. It focuses on good energy and calming, focusing, and de-stressing the self, which is fantastic for helping presence. And just acting out aspects of self, whatever you've learned or believed, without concern for the situation, outcomes, or for the needs of others, then we're just living off of ego-driven behavior without a useful helping purpose. So just people who act out, this used to happen a lot after people took an MBTI and they found out that they were internal or external, they found out that they were introvert or extrovert, or they found out something else, and then they started acting out that behavior. And just saying it's okay because this is what I am. That's I think a misuse of that kind of knowledge, and it's not done in a context with a purpose or a service to other people. Next. Ourselves are the primary instrument. It relates to all we do in our roles and what impact we have. In fact, because wherever you go, there you are. Your use of self is with you all the time, at home, at work, at parties, with your friends. You're always there. It starts with understanding self, and that is a social process. It takes two to see one. And that is critical in how we learn. You cannot just sit by yourself writing a journal or thinking about what you believe about yourself. You can start there. That's a very good start. Then you got to get other people's point of view. Conscious presence is wonderful because it's the only way we take in data from situations. When we are sitting in the room and we're not present, we are also not taking much data in. Have reflective practices. We build our reflective practices. Some people love journals. Some people hate journals. I don't care how we do it, but you have to have a way to either talk through it or think through it so that you're cementing learning inside your system. And each situation is a new opportunity to be your best self. So let's see if we can stop there. If you want to do different things, you got to do things differently. And I think this was a very creative mother who figured this out. Next. All right, next one. Yep. So I thank you for this time, and we'll do some Q&A or whatever we can, or whatever's come up in the chat now. And I want you to know that on the rest of the slides, there's a set of reflective questions that you might have some fun thinking through and working for yourself. And then there's a couple of pages of resources on use of self in the slide deck. So I guess one of you can see what was in the chat, and we can
Yes.
do, I think we're a little over, but.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. So Eddie asks, your discussion of Leuenfeld's theory reminds me also of Bordeaux's habitus, disposition, and field and guidance structuration. Can you address the constantly changing self?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because I don't think I know the other theory that well. If what it means, if the phrase constantly changing self, I would think of that as, I think myself stays the same mostly if I am not picking up new learning and making conscious choices about what I'm going to do next. And that's how I think I did a lot of the work for myself over the last 50 years probably, was I knew things that I wasn't good at. I knew things that were getting in my way. And it took a long time and help from others to actually be able to improve on that. And I wished I could say I was done now. It's not done yet. There's 2 new things in the last year that have come up for me that I think I need to do more with. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering that question well, but that's how I would think about what changes is what. Go ahead.
We have another one. What if an organization or leader does not allow time for reflection pause? What approaches would you recommend?
I would say, I don't think this is like a big disruption kind of pause. I think what we need to do is practice ourselves in how, while we're listening to stuff and while we're sitting taking in data, we are automatically moving through options in our head in terms of possibilities for our role. And the only way I can do that, for example, is when I am emotionally negatively triggered. I have to stop that, because nobody else will stop that. And I have to not let that override what I'm thinking about and how I'm trying to choose what I think will be my best choice. And I think that's why, I mean, the practicing of that is really critical, because what happens is if the emotional trigger takes over, then we lose the cognitive side to think differently. And so we have to help ourselves self-manage that piece in the moment, and maybe hold that feeling for another time, but actually think about, what am I going to do next? And that's, nobody else provides the permission for that to happen. And we can't say, let's stop the meeting because I got to go think about it, because no leader is going to allow that probably. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question. So this question is, can you say a few words about sticking the balance between feedback and expectations by others and the way in which we define ourselves?
Feedback and expectations.
Mhm.
Okay. And the way we define ourselves. It's a very good question. It's probably got more layers than I'm thinking about at the moment, but what it comes to me is that the feedback is best when you are asking for it, because your own self-assessment helps you to know which areas you want to know things that other people feel or are impacted by, or what their opinion of something you did is. But you're focusing it some. That's the best way to get feedback. Random feedback that happens in the moment by other people, you can take it in and say, I'll think about that. You don't know whether that's relevant to something you're doing. And what you might be getting is someone's opinion that is also based in their expectation of your role. Meaning, let's say you're the fourth leader in a particular leadership position, there might be a ton of expectations on that role that have absolutely nothing to do with you. And so some people use expectations as a form of feedback, and what you want to try to do is turn it around and build. You're legitimately asking for feedback about things that you're trying to work with. And at the same time, you can ask people for all their expectations at some point. And then that gives you more time to think through them and work with them. But you don't define yourself just based on others' feedback or just based on their expectations. You have to have, excuse me, you have to have your own opinions based on your own experiences and your own self-assessment. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Jamieson for sharing his knowledge, expertise, and wisdom with us today. If we did not get to your question, please feel free to send us an email, which you can find on your screen. On behalf of the OD&C program, we hope that you found this webinar helpful, and registrations for all other events can be found on our social media platforms. Feel free to visit our website on the screen or email us with any questions. Thank you for attending today and being such a great audience with great questions. We hope to have you back on October 30th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And please feel free to share a webinar series with your networks and social media platforms, as all are welcomed and invited. Thanks so much.